Hello, welcome to Intersections, May 13th, 10:30 a.m. Pacific Daylight Savings Time. You'll notice something a little bit different about today's format, which is that I appear to be both John and also Brian, who is off doing something else today, but will be back next week. So it falls to me the happy task of welcoming you to Intersections, our weekly conversational jam session that explores the intersections among technology, innovation, culture, and ideas, that dives deep with an extraordinary roster of guests, today's two guests being no exception to that rule. We love bringing diverse personalities together to talk about issues of the day in service of greater understanding and unlearning. We're kind of believers in this whole notion of beginner's mind, that sometimes, as the Zen Buddhists like to say, um, experts tend to know many things and beginners know nothing when they start out, which is why new things begin with beginner's mind. A mind that's free of preconceptions is able to entertain new radical ideas, and that is what we traffic in here. So a couple of other things. We are privileged to have a global audience, so please let us know where you're viewing us from. We're particularly pleased that it's such a global audience. Our audience also is growing. We have some very interesting and pending announcements that we'll be making in due course about the expansion of the Intersections footprint to other parts of the world and other media landscapes that may involve different language editions of Intersections. And of course, we perennially threaten to finish our newsletter and to publish the print versions of these interviews, which I think bear reading, because these are not temporal interviews that are relevant for that particular week. These are interviews that are evergreen. And so we view our work here as building an edifice of understanding brick by brick in relation to all of the talented people that we're able to bring on board. Just to review the bidding in terms of who we are, Brian, my partner in this enterprise, is Global Innovation Evangelist for Salesforce. He's a noted multiple best-selling author on matters primarily having to do with the digital domain. He was digital before digital was a thing and has explored the links between digital technology and marketing, and digital technology and innovation and the enterprise. And the thing that I particularly like about working with Brian is that we are both obsessed by the topic of innovation, which is in a constant state of evolution. Our perspectives and our networks are highly complementary. And so with that, I think we are able to say with a straight face that we have a, if not 360, at least let's call it 270 degree coverage of the topic. I myself have been working in the innovation field formally for over 30 years. I was a professor at Harvard Business School, don't hold that against me, where I started the curriculum on business creativity and innovation. But I've been a practitioner, I've been a CEO, a serial startup person, advisor to lots of companies, and also to countries like Singapore and Finland and Australia and Abu Dhabi that are, I would say, relatively well positioned for this global innovation economy that we are inhabiting. And I bring some oddball credentials to the table, including an MD and a residency in psychiatry at Mass General Hospital, a couple of credits for producing feature films, and even a Tony nomination. So my work has been very much about immersing myself in different lanes, different worlds of innovation, and understanding deeply, what is the Silicon Valley model, the Harvard Business School model, the Broadway model, the Hollywood, all of these different kind of, in a sense, definitions, epistemologies, and toolboxes, and then bringing them together for the benefit of people who are in the hot seat for delivering on innovation agendas, which are my favorite kind of people. So you can find out more about Brian and me by looking us up on social media. There's a lot of, probably too much material out there on the internet about us. And with that, I want to again welcome you to the show. We have two amazing guests today. And I want to first bring onto the stage Shellye Archambeau. So Greg, if you can do the honors. And here she is instamagically. So welcome to Intersections.
Well, thanks very much, John. Been looking forward to it.
So, Shellye, you're kind of the embodiment, really, of intersectionality in the sense that you've done so many different things. You work in the private sector, you work in the nonprofit sector, you work as a board member, but also as someone who's gotten their fingernails dirty. Not that you have dirty fingernails, but you've gotten your fingernails dirty doing the hard work of innovation. You're a member of the board of directors of Verizon and Nordstrom and Roper Technologies and Okta. Well, I guess I'd like to start off by just asking you, with all of that going on in your life, what's now at the top of your agenda? And if we look at your pie chart in terms of how you're organizing your time and how you're prioritizing, what does that look like? It's a time of great ferment. We're reemerging from the pandemic. I'm sure you're picking up traces of different kinds of thinking and different narratives from all of these different amazing listening perches that you have. So what's exciting in your world, and how are you putting it all together?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. I'll tell you, this phase of my life, which is the life after passing my full-time operational CEO job baton, is really all about impact and inspiration, John. If I'm not impacting something or somebody or inspiring something or somebody, then I'm just not doing it. So that as a framework for how I think about where I spend my time is really helpful. So the areas that drive me, where I spend the majority of my time today, is thinking about, all right, how do I do that? How do I make an impact? And I wrote the book Unapologetically Ambitious, take risks, break barriers, and create success on your own terms, because I'm trying to get strategies and approaches, hacks even, right, learnings to more people, more professionals, so that they can actually achieve what they want out of life professionally, but also personally. And in doing that, the book is one thing. I'm spending a lot of time. I do Ask Me Anythings, regularly. I spend a lot of time putting stuff out there on social media. I'm just trying to reach more people, if you will, at scale. I'm also trying to impact companies, whether that's through the board work that I do, or it's through some of the initiatives that I'm engaged with around trying to help create an environment in which companies can also be more successful in both how they retain employees, hire employees, drive diversity, et cetera.
So to what extent do you see yourself as being part of a leading wave of change in, I would say, broadly corporate culture? We've started to notice that the Business Roundtable talks about the social as, in addition to the shareholder value definition of purpose in companies. And I think purpose is becoming a much more frequently observed word in corporate annual reports and in CEO presentations and so on. Do you see this as being a trend, a thing? And if so, what's causing it now in particular? And how is your work kind of, I see you almost as like a surfboard perched on that big wave. And how are you putting that together?
Yeah, so I'm definitely seeing it. And yes, it is definitely more common now. But I'll be candid, John. I feel that the best companies that have sustained over the years have always had a purpose, and have focused on not just the shareholders, but also their employees and their suppliers and the communities in which they operate. So yes, we're defining it more now, but it's not like this is a brand new thing. Many companies actually had that broader view before, may not have articulated it as strongly. But the good news is more and more are joining that view. And what do I think is driving it? Listen, I give a lot of credit to the millennials and the Gen Zs. I mean, my generation, I'm the very end of the baby boomers, right? We did a lot to kind of mess up this world. And I'm thrilled, frankly, that the millennials and the Gen Zs are trying to hold companies and entities and governments accountable to say, hey, wait a minute, we need to be able to live and work and thrive, right, in a very productive and positive environment. So what are you doing about that?
Well, it's interesting. I guess the boomers are rallying around the last hurrah of maybe trying to leave the world a little bit better in terms of its condition than when they came into it, because the opposite certainly could be argued as well. You and I are probably a part of that rearguard action to try to
Exactly.
clean things up a bit. One thing that I noticed is that whereas I agree, companies have always had some good companies have always had a sense of social purpose and responsibility and community engagement and so on. One thing that seems to be somewhat different is the embracing of collective purposes in the sense of the Sustainable Development Goals, or larger overarching themes that affect global civil society. So it isn't just about we want to be good citizens in our community, but how do we become an environmentally sustainability, social equality promoting enterprise. And I wonder if you're seeing that, because doing good locally versus doing good for all of us seems to be a bit of a shift in the landscape.
Yes, and I agree with that. And I think where that's fitting, again, good companies tend to build these concepts into the strategy and how they approach things. So having an environment that is sustainable is actually also in the company's best interest. So therefore, they're realizing that, okay, their voice, their effort, their dollars need to go in those directions as well. So when you think about trying to reduce carbon footprint, or trying to ensure that we're driving, recycling, that they're not leaving places, right, worse than they took them over. To me, that's all about long-term and long-term view of having an environment in which the company, the employees, but as well as society in general, right, will be able to continue and to thrive. So I see it as companies realizing the power that they have, and actually taking advantage of that power for the broader good, which, oh, by the way, comes back to them in branding and support and their ability to hire these new employees who actually want to work for places that are making an impact.
What goes around comes around, as they say.
For sure. For sure. And the good news is we're actually starting to realize it again.
Well, speaking of that, what's the impact, do you think, of the pandemic been on the thought process of corporate leadership? Or what are you noticing? Because that certainly has been a high impact, unpredicted event. How is that affecting the thought process, do you think?
I think it's one of the drivers to having companies actually spend some time reimagining what looks like going forward. One of the advantages, there weren't many, but one of the advantages of the whole pandemic that we had was everybody to a person actually suddenly became a real person. And what I mean by that is, I don't care if you're the CEO, a board director, a senior vice president, some call, some Zoom you're on, a child came through, lawns started going off, things happened that let people know, hey, gosh, you're a real person. We all have the same kinds of challenges. And I do believe that is going to help foster more empathy in the corporate environment, which in general will create an environment which I think employees will be able to thrive and operate better. So that dynamic of, okay, understanding this is true, combined with, there really are some roles that can have a lot more flexibility than we realized and still be able to get things done. So I do think you'll also see companies that actually offer and have more flexibility, whether that's time spent in office or time not spent in office, hours worked, whatever it might be. I think coming out of this, we're going to see a new model. I don't know of one company, John, that expects to operate post-pandemic the way they operated pre-pandemic. And frankly, I think that's a good thing.
So how are they, based on your, listening post situation where you get to see a lot of these deliberations, how are they going about thinking about making these changes or entertaining these new possibilities? Because it's one thing to say, yeah, we went through the pandemic and it shook us up and now we're going to think differently. But are you noticing process around this in the sense that there are teams being convened or new kind of organizational initiatives, so that they can put heft behind the intention?
The answer is absolutely. And it's a spectrum, because I'm involved in Yeah, so let me
Curious to know
share
what you're
some.
seeing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So let me share some. So I'm involved, engaged with companies from, startups to Fortune 15 companies, right? So in that breadth, are they the same? No, not the same. But there are some companies that are saying, you know what? We actually don't need an office. We believe that we can actually make the environment in which we operate permanently, right, flexible. Now, is that all companies? No. But for some companies, depending upon what they're doing, their size, scale, what roles people have, that will work. But what I see in the larger companies is a number of them are actually starting to test things. They're looking at, okay, so what's required? Why do people actually need to be in the office? When they're in the office, what does that mean? Because, for instance, just allowing people to the option of, hey, come to the office when you want to, may not be that productive. Because if I show up, but nobody else on my team is actually in the office, then have I really gained anything by being in the office? So thinking about it in terms of scheduling, well, maybe there's times or days, right, when certain people should be together and certain people shouldn't. What are the new tools and knowledge that our managers need on how to actually manage this overall dynamic of people who are maybe physically present, but maybe not physically present? How do I handle more distributed teams? How do I lead? How does opportunity come, right? All those things. So I'm seeing companies really wrestling with this, but trying to be very thoughtful. So what are the new sets of skills that are required? What are those skills? And then how do we make sure we help employees as well as management skill up to be successful in this overall environment? And then how do we think about who comes and who doesn't?
And who's in that conversation in the at the executive level to figure out these experiments and so on? I mean, imagine it's a lot more than HR. It has
Oh
to
yeah,
be
it's
kind of a C-suite type of.
absolutely. You have operational execs and you have IT, right? Because again, back to tools. I have some companies that are actually developing tools because they don't see anything out there in the marketplace that will actually help for this,
Them.
right? So you have that combination of the right people around the room. But the best thing, frankly, is when you have small teams that pull resources and knowledge as they need them versus big teams to solve this kind of challenge.
Yeah, so I guess companies that are used to working in a more entrepreneurial way across organizational boundaries and kind of form follows function in a way, are going to be able to address this because what you're saying resonates with me greatly, that it's a multifactorial kind of issue now. I mean, and the pandemic has done us the favor in a way of shaking us up and allowing us to entertain all kinds of new possibilities, but then process, who's at the table and what are their kind of authorities and what are the expectations around coming up with something new and adding rigor to it. So it's about evidence and not just kind of how you feel about it in terms of changing the equation around work. I mean, that's all, I think, extremely important. So companies that have already a tradition of being able to think that way are probably the ones that have a leg up.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. And have you noticed just over the last year and a half or so, have you noticed a change just in the tone, like of board meetings and, senior level dialogue? I mean, I would imagine that there's been a shift, and the shift probably has a number of different flavors, or is it pretty much the same, smart people talking about tough stuff?
When you say tone, I think certain topics are taking more time, as a percentage of time spent in meetings. For instance, ESG, environmental social governance, those type of topics we are definitely spending more time talking about those issues, right, than we had just a couple of years back. We are also spending more time, which is not surprising, but talking about how do we what does operations look like in the future, right? We're spending time on looking at strategy as it relates to the overall pandemic. Most companies that I'm engaged with, when pandemic first hit, the first 4 to 8 weeks was all about, okay, quick, let's make sure we can survive something that we don't know about, right? But then it quickly pivoted to, okay, given that the world is changing, how does this affect our strategy? Are there actually steps we can take to accelerate what we were trying to do, right? Immediately slip to overall strategy. And so where we are today is we're spending a good amount of time talking about overall strategy and working through, now that we feel the pandemic, there's more known today than was known in the future, which makes it easier to plan. It was very challenging to plan a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, planning in the face of absolute uncertainty is always a bit of a
Exactly.
headache. You know, I think in between the lines, you're saying something that I've noticed. I'm on a couple of boards myself, and I've noticed that the pandemic seems to have brought out more empathy, even in the interactions among people on the board itself, or empathy with regard to people who are the full-time leadership of the organization, and then empathy in terms of the people in the organization, and empathy in terms of the people who are stakeholders in what the organization does. And it comes out in lots of different and probably mostly subtle ways. But, you know, this existential experience of facing death and upheaval and uncertainty, and needing to rally around a new set of ideas, I think, you know, in my experience, has brought out some really good qualities in people that are beyond the typical, we're going to think in a very high quality, rational way about, you know, what we're doing, and, you know, review the evidence, and, you know, come together to be a well-managed entity. And I suspect that it will have an impact on this notion of purpose as well, that we talked about earlier.
Yeah,
I
agree.
Yeah,
I agree. I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
No, after you.
No, I was going to say with the empathy piece, which we, you know, also touched on right in the beginning, in terms of something, I think it's going to be hindsight when they look back at this period. I think the whole empathetic leadership element will be something that's actually written about, because I do think it will make a significant impact on just overall approach to leadership, to how we do things, all of it, which I see as very positive.
So we talked mostly at the macro level. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking, you know, at the micro level, because you're the author of this very celebrated book, Unapologetically Ambitious, and I know you're doing mentoring and strategic advising. By the way, Lorraine Harrington was my classmate in business school, so I know her quite well. You can, if you have a chance, say hi to her. That would be very amusing.
She's a good friend. Absolutely.
Yeah. What are the key points that you would make to someone who is receptive to this idea of embracing a higher performance life, creating success on their own terms, being unapologetically ambitious, and fitting into this kind of new climate of opportunities to express purpose and to work within the business world in a different way? What are the key pieces of advice that you might offer, or what are the key framing ideas?
Sure. Yeah, the main one is to realize that you own your career. You do. Not your boss, not your company, not your mentor, not your spouse. It's you. So be intentional about what you are doing versus just waiting for somebody to tap you on the shoulder and say, oh, you want to do this now? Okay. Oh, you want to do that now? I mean, think about it. You would never spend, you know, thousands of dollars for an airline ticket, pack your bags, put the dog in the kennel, right? Get to the airport, strap in the seatbelt, and then look at the pilot and say, so where are we going anyway? Right? I mean, right? You ever do that? But we do that with our careers all the time. We spend tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on education and training and, you know, conferences and reading and all these things to kind of help us be successful. And then we put our head down and wait for somebody to tell us what to do. No. You know, the biggest piece or message is really all about own your career, own your life, be intentional about what you're doing, decide where you want to head, and then take help, which is the other key message. Because you know what? A lot of people think asking for help is a weakness, John. I have found it to be a strength, not a weakness, a strength. Because very little that you have to go do, I don't care if it's a new job, if it's a speech, if it's whatever it might be, very little of that has no one else done before. So if other people have done it, go find them, learn from them, right? So you can start on like first base instead of home plate. But all of these elements say that you actually have more power than you realize. So use your power to actually help orchestrate the life that you want.
How does that jibe with a career path in a company? I mean, it sounds like you're preaching to legions of people who will become entrepreneurs, right? Because I mean, isn't entrepreneurship really about designing your own path and designing your own criteria for success and satisfaction. And
Well,
companies offer jobs, right, and career paths and HR functions and advancement and bonuses, and that's
exactly.
the pilot telling you where the journey is going. Isn't that right?
Well, the answer is not necessarily. Okay. So even when you look at entrepreneurship, you have the founder. All right. So the founder sets the direction, but there are people still working for that founder that have jobs, that have roles, that have things to go do. And trust me, you can still absolutely drive your career in a company, no matter how small or how large. I spent the first 14 years at IBM, and I was very ambitious. I had targets. I rose to levels to the point where nobody looked like me was higher than me. My boss reported to Lou Gerstner, the CEO, is running multi-billion-dollar divisions. I mean, so no, you can absolutely have the impact that you want. And whatever size company that you're in, the key is to decide, though, what you want, and then figure out a plan of how to actually go get there. The biggest approach that I took, and I talk about this kind of through the book, is really about, all right, what is it that I want? What is it I'm trying to either achieve, create, or impact? And then once I answer that question, then I say, great, what has to be true for me to do that? Now, I don't know what has to be true. I said I want to be CEO. What had to be true? I had no idea. So I had to go do the research, the homework, I call it, right? Who are the CEOs? What do they do? What's their background? What are their lives like? What kind of support systems do they have, right? All these things. And then once I understand what's required, then I say, okay, how do I make that true for me? And that becomes my plan. All right, I need P&L jobs. Okay, I need to be a good speaker. Okay, I need to have flexibility to be able to move if that's required. Okay, I need to, right, whatever it happens to be. And then here's the key, because a lot of people, John, establish goals, right? Some people put a plan in place to achieve the goals. But I find that very few people make decisions every day consistent with their plan. And that's where the power unlock really is.
Woody Allen said that 90% of success was showing up, and I think by that he meant consistency. And I know this from my time in music. You advance a lot more rapidly if you do 10 minutes a day of exercises as opposed to 2 hours the day before your lesson.
Yep.
But and I think what you're saying is so valuable. One wishes for a boot camp or a playbook or a piece of software that can kind of extract these principles and then apply that kind of sense of rhythm to the questions that you're posing, because it's so easy to get distracted, and it's so easy if you don't have a dashboard in a way to kind of not see that need for checking off a box every day on your journey to these goals. And that's I guess, whether you look at it from a musical point of view or other perspectives, the word practice really comes into play, because you're talking about a practice, right? It's really, in a way, attunement to yourself, the practice of advancing your path, in your career. And it isn't just getting a few ideas and then moving on to other stuff. It's really embedding those questions inside of you every day. I mean, for the long haul.
Exactly. I mean, and John, to make that happen, once I made a plan, I just assumed the plan was going to happen. Now, did it happen every time just the way I thought? No.
Yeah.
But by assuming it was going to happen, I make decisions today to set myself up for the next steps, right? Versus hoping it would happen and not make those decisions. And then when I do get opportunities, I'm not ready. I'm not prepared. I haven't practiced. And then all of a sudden I don't compete as well as I should compete when the opportunity actually came along. I missed it. So, that's, to me, that's a big part of it. I fully agree with the whole notion of practice, because frankly, very few of us are born with all these skills. I mean, I consider some of my strengths to be courage and discipline, and I wasn't born with either one of them. So you can develop and strengthen and build skills just by practice.
And by exemplars like yourself. I have to reach over to my desk and show you what I have up on my kind of little bulletin board here.
Yep, I love it.
Yeah, it's to just create a sense of optimism and that all things are possible, and not to kind of get entangled in your own stuff, which can easily translate into doubt or anxiety or overthinking or any one of a dozen obstacles.
Yeah, listen, it's true. I think in some ways I was fortunate in that I realized very early in life that the odds weren't in my favor. They just weren't in my favor to get whatever I wanted. And therefore, I had to figure out what I was going to go do differently to improve my odds. And it's this whole planning and this notion of making decisions consistent with the plan and doing the research. I mean, all those things were ways I was trying to improve my odds to get what I want. Well, the truth is, for a lot of people, odds aren't in our favor. So be intentional and improve the odds because you can.
Well, I'm seeing clearly why you're such a compelling public speaker, why you're an in-demand advisor, and why people love your book. And I'm going to make sure that I do a thorough read of your book, because it sounds like you and I are in violent agreement about a lot of things. Shellye, it's really great to meet you. It's really great to see you. Such an honor. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show. And thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, John.
Okay. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So let's see. Do we have an engineer? I don't think we have an engineer. Let me see. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears here. So thank you, Shellye. And I'm going to, wow. It's funny. I kind of assumed that engineering this show was so complicated, but actually you just kind of mouse over some of the little screens here and it all gets resolved. So I'm feeling very powerful now, which is probably a good place to be in terms of introducing our next guest. And I'll probably mangle your name a little bit, but it's Francesco Marconi. Yes,
that's perfect.
Excellent. Okay, fine. So I've been looking forward to speaking with you ever since I heard about your willingness to come on the show. Thank you very much for being here. You are co-founder and CEO of a company called Applied XL, which is an information company that tracks the health of people, places, and planets. So I'm getting the feeling of a kind of data science-driven dashboard of quite interesting proportions. But what's particularly intriguing is that you were the head of R&D at the Wall Street Journal, and that was about adding data science and automation to the workflow in the newsroom, as I understand it. And you've written a book that I can't wait to read called Newsmakers, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Journalism. So I wish we had about 2 hours, but we have 25 minutes, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be connecting virtually. As I was planning this conversation with you, I realized that we came across once, and we came across at the United Nations. I believe you were in New York, and you were giving a seminar or a lecture there. And, right. Obviously there were many people there, but the reason I remember is that you ended a little book, I believe it was Innovation Manifesto, that I still have it. And this was, this was 12 years ago. And, I think it just comes full circle. It's great to be here, and thanks for hosting me on your show.
Well, that's a heartwarming anecdote. For those of you that don't know, I inspired partly by the Little Red Book in the Cultural Revolution. I did a Little Orange Book of Innovation that had 20 principles, very succinct, with some graphics by Nigel Holmes, who did information graphics for the Wall Street Journal for a long time. And I just started giving them away, and they were, I think, for the most part, people felt they were too nice to throw away, and they put them in their pockets and so on. So occasionally I get these Innovation Manifesto stories, and thank you very much for that. So look, I'm curious, we could just take it out of the title of your book. It's Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Journalism. what is the future of journalism in relation to AI and data science? And it's probably not one future, I would imagine, because there's a creative tension just in the title you've
Yeah,
articulated.
yeah,
So what's
absolutely.
that all about?
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, there are many different futures of journalism, and the reality is that there have been many tools over the history of the industry and the profession that people have used. And I believe that data science and artificial intelligence is no different than the introduction of other tools in the past, from the telephone when first appeared in newsrooms, to the typewriter, to the computer. These are tools that essentially, if used properly, enhance the human intellect and create efficiencies. And like in any other technology that is introduced, there's always reluctancy to adoption. And usually the anecdote that I like to share is that when typewriters were introduced in newsrooms, 50, 60, even more years ago, a lot of people were not happy because they were used to do work differently. And so if you fast forward to now the present, you see sort of this creative tension, to your point, where there's this optimism of, yes, new technology can help us dig deeper into the story, find insights within large data sets. But it's also natural for people to be concerned of whether a machine will replace their jobs in their function. And the reality is that all technology, specifically artificial intelligence, will change the nature of roles. Some roles might disappear, but new roles are emerging. And I'll share just one additional thought, which is, during my time at the Wall Street Journal and prior to that at the Associated Press, there were new roles being created as a direct result of data science and AI entering the newsroom, from computational journalists that use techniques of data science for investigation, to automation editors who are responsible for checking whether these automated systems are working properly, all the way to people's whose job is to purely manage the portfolio of tools that journalists have now at their disposal. So the future of journalism is what the next generation of leaders in the news space will say it will be. And I think that the key message of the book is also humans are in control, and as journalists we have the responsibility to holding AI accountable to the same transparency standards as we hold any of our sources.
So there's a fair amount of discussion about human-machine hybrids and centaur intelligence, which is the head of a person and the body of a beast or a machine. And now we have software that already can take a topic and write essentially a 10-page report on something and have it read reasonably well. And there was just an article recently about how by programming certain parameters in, you could get the AI to simulate the writing style of a particular, let's call it, an essayist who, there was an article recently where the first paragraph was written by the essayist and the second paragraph was written by the machine, but they didn't tell you that in advance. And then at the end of the second paragraph, they said, "Did you notice anything?" And the answer was no, because they were quite indistinguishable. So how is the advent of AI and data science going to change the nature of journalism? I mean, journalism is changing already because, in a way, the volume of information is flowing from the long form, really kind of creative essayist form of journalism to myriad bits of information that are floating around in these constellations mediated with varying degrees of effectiveness by social media. And what will it do to our patterns of consumption?
Yeah, so I mean, journalism, or I should say, AI is changing the three value points of the journalistic practice. So from the gathering of the information, so where's the data coming from the processing and analysis of that information, all the way to the distribution, which was the last point you were talking about around automation. And I'll go into a little bit of detail on each one of those. The first one is on the gathering of information. Traditional news gathering processes have been historically manual, relying on interviews with human sources, doing some research, review of documents, and so on. Now, AI, in more specifically the fields of machine learning and natural language processing, which is the analysis of text at scale, are enabling journalists to look at patterns within large corpuses of documents. So the source material is being accessed to in a much more streamlined and at the same time at scale. And these capabilities are going to be foundational for the future of journalism, because in the next 3 years, there will be more data produced than in the last 30 years. So as a journalist, as a professional whose job is to make information public and contextualize it, it's humanly impossible to keep up with the explosion of data. So that's where these smart and intelligent systems come into play, which is there's a data sphere that is exploding. How do I make sense of it, and how do I look for the things that are most relevant? And that's where the second step comes into play, which is the analysis or the processing of that information. Once you have the data, once you have these signals, how do you define what's relevant and what's not? It's certainly not the machine that is making these decisions blindly. And this is actually one of the areas that I'm most excited about, which is the notion of editorial algorithms. And so editorial algorithms are algorithms that are programmed and defined through journalistic parameters. So in simple words, they follow the same steps or procedures or validation checkpoints as a human journalist would do, but they can do this at scale. And so the natural question to ask is, well, if you are then just doing this quote unquote knowledge transfer from the process that is in the head of the journalist to the algorithm, then the journalist's job will disappear. And it's actually the opposite, because it requires constant calibration and fine tuning. I think you alluded to this, where you have all of these new models where you have a human in the loop, and this human override is crucial, because then in certain instances the machine, like any other machine in the real world, stops working as optimal as you initially programmed. So this is the idea that journalists become information officers, but also the arbiters of algorithmic transparency. So, sorry, go ahead, John.
I think you were on a roll, because there's one more piece, I think.
Yeah, and then the third piece, again, you have the collection of the data, you have the analysis and the processing through editorial algorithms, and then you have the distribution. So this is usually what's referred as automation, where you turn that data, you turn whatever you analyzed, and you produce it at scale. And I'll give you some examples of that, and also some pitfalls of those approaches. And so one of the initial case studies of this in a significant way was the automation of financial and economic reports by the Associated Press, that as a news agency is by nature a need to just distribute as much information as possible to other information providers. And so in that the way that automation works is that once you have that structured data, so it works very well for economic data or financial data or sports or elections. Then you have automation editors that go into the data and think, okay, what are the different variations that this story could take? Well, this company could post profits, but it could also post losses, or this is expected by the analysts, or it's unexpected. And so think about this as this is called branch writing, which is thinking about all the variations where the story could go. And so these templates could be pretty long. And so where the machine comes into place, then matching the data that is feeding into these models into the appropriate branches of the story. So that's in a way a supervised way of creating these automated stories, and the reason why journalists and newsrooms are doing that is because there's a lot of control. You can go through the same fact-checking steps as you would do for a normal story. Now, the things that you're talking about, where you have models from, like the famous one is GPT-3 from OpenAI, that you feed them a prompt and then they write a pretty compelling article. That's really good for marketing or creative writing or fiction writing. But when it comes to having the facts and the accuracy of news reporting, those models are not that relevant because they are too broad. So the point here is that journalists in these newsrooms that do have the resources and are investing in AI, journalists are becoming the specialists in these editorial algorithms that can write and report stories.
So how widespread is the use of AI and data science related tools in journalism today? Are we just at the beginning of the adoption curve where organizations like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and Time Magazine can afford them and can afford the experimentation? Or are we later in the adoption curve where it's becoming mainstream? And also, to what extent does this kind of democratize journalism and empower, lots and lots of smaller publications or smaller journalistic operations?
Yeah, that's a great question, because where we are on the adoption curve depends obviously on the geographic region. So the US is far ahead from Europe, from Asia, from other regions around the world, and also it's dependent on the size of the organization. And actually, it's something that I would say it's one of the biggest concerns, which is there's a massive innovation gap between the well-staffed and well-resourced news organizations like the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the New York Times and the smaller publications. And that's problematic because if you think about the exponential gains in efficiency, in coverage that AI can get you, what happens in the long term, if you don't close that innovation gap between the big publications and the small ones, is that the big publications just become completely dominant, and then the smaller publications end up disappearing. And there's even a phenomena called news deserts, where certain communities, certain counties are not being served with the information they need. So the way for solving that problem is in different ways. So the first one is really democratizing the knowledge, because it's really about showing what's possible, and in a way that was the goal of the book that I wrote, coming from the perspective of two large organizations. I know that actually the technology is not that expensive because with cloud computing costs going down, all of these tech companies providing the infrastructure, what you really need is the knowledge for implementing. This is some people refer to this as the last mile of AI, where you are basically connecting the AI infrastructure from Amazon or or Google and making a use case out of it. And so there's a lot of I think there should be a lot of emphasis on democratizing knowledge, but at the same time, there's a lot of investment, specifically by nonprofit organizations supporting supporting local newsrooms. Actually, just today, the Knight Foundation, who provides a lot of grants for journalism, just announced a major effort around AI in local newsrooms. So again, currently there's a massive innovation gap that needs to be addressed, because at the end of the day, it will impact how us as a society have access to reliable information.
Well, and also, we haven't really talked too much about the demand side of the equation, but it seems to me that these new technologies are going to change. They are already changing the way people consume news and news in the broadest sense. I mean, first of all, there's the whole question of personalization, and within that is the question of whether personalization also carries biases, right? Because you're telling the algorithms what you want to learn about, but you're not necessarily going outside of your bubble. But also, it kind of, in a way, differentiates between news as the kind of information feeds that you need, just the 100 facts that you need every day to kind of know what's going on, versus the deeper op-ed, opinion, New Yorker style, 30,000 word articles that really go deeply into a subject. And those shifting patterns, I imagine, will have some implications for what news organizations will need to serve up. And to your point about the resource base for smaller organizations, they're not going to be able to support certain genres of interpretive journalism. And then the commodity side will actually be, there's economies of scale from having that more centralized, I would imagine. And so why would you, if you're in the middle of nowhere, be investing in doing that when somebody else can do it better? So what's happening on the demand side?
Yeah, I mean, I think there will be specialization of these different types of journalism. So on one side, sort of this approach that is more programmatic that I'm describing, that almost becomes an information science rather than journalism. And then on the other side, you have the feature writing, the artistic form of the journalistic craft. And so, there are, on one side, I want to talk about sort of the problem of personalization, but perhaps also how we can solve it, and how it relates to this specialization. So as you mentioned, personalization of the experience leads to filter bubbles, where the algorithms start learning that you are interested in a particular point of view, and it's just serving that information to you. What happens is that people end up in their information cocoons, and that's one of the drivers of societal polarization. And so that's a major risk. At the same time, there's this saying that media bias is bad for democracy but good for the media business. Meaning, if you look at the news organizations that have large news audiences, they tend either to lean liberal or conservative, because people are attracted by their point of view. They want to confirm their beliefs. This is confirmation bias. So what happens with a lot of these algorithms is that they are feeding this confirmation bias, which again is not a good thing for democracy. So I think that's where the topics of information transparency and balance come into play, where I think journalists can play a major role in holding these algorithms accountable. And in fact, there's speaking of like genres of journalism, there's a new area of journalism emerging called algorithmic transparency reporting, which really focuses on unveiling the unfairness and the biases that exist within machines. And so if you think about it, it's no different than reporting on what's wrong in the world, but in this case, it's reporting on what's wrong in the machines, from racial biases to the robots becoming sexist in all of these things. So that's why usually people talk about how the big tech companies are dominating the space and they are empowered to do whatever they want. But in reality, I think other professions, including journalists, have a key role in the future of ethical AI, to basically reduce all of these biases that we are talking about.
Well, it's it's that old Roman saying about who watches the watchers, and there are. I mean, I would imagine there are dystopian pathways for AI-enabled journalism to follow. Because you could imagine algorithms being mechanisms for amplifying bias, and you could imagine algorithms fighting with other algorithms for the information space and for attention. You could imagine fake news being amplified by algorithms because you can do deep research and come up with justification for your point of view that may be extremely biased but look extremely convincing, and so forth and so on. So I think what you're talking about in terms of the notion of creating ethical standards. I mean, in the old days, you'd read the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, and you would have confidence that there would be journalistic integrity, right? And I don't know that we've resolved the question of who puts that good housekeeping seal of approval on news that's generated in a digital environment. So there are some really weighty ethical questions, and also questions about avoiding the dystopian, Orwellian scenarios. We just have another minute or two, but any parting thoughts about that?
Yeah, in the most important currency in information is trust. And in a world where information is retrieved and produced by algorithms, that trust comes through transparency. And so right now, a lot of the platforms that we all use don't really reveal the decision patterns behind those algorithms. And I think there will be a push towards that transparency because it's the only way for us to build trust between humans and machines.
Well, let's hope that happens, and let's hope that happens soon. And it also, I think what you're talking about depends on having educated consumers of information, right? Because you have to care about transparency, and you have to trust is a two-way street, right? So you have to not only trust the information, but be a vehicle for trust, so that your choices about what you consume and what you wind up believing have some degree of authenticity and aren't just part of a journalistic and news bubble, as you said. So I could go on for hours because this is really fascinating. I'm going to order your book ASAP, and maybe I'll have some more intelligent questions for you in another round. The book is Newsmakers, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Journalism, and our guest in the second half of today has been Francesco Marconi, who I understand we have a pre-existing relationship from 12 years ago. So especially happy to see you on the show. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you for having me, John.
Yep. All the best. Thank you. Well, so I guess that wraps up another show. That was really pretty exciting. Next week, we will be back with our dynamic duo. It was a pleasure to kind of be Brian and John today. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week, 10:30 Pacific Daylight Time, for another episode of Intersections. And I don't think we have exit music. So, and I'm not near the piano. We might have exit music, but I tend to doubt it. So just imagine that it's that kind of dreamy improv, and we'll provide you with some more music on another occasion. I actually have another broadcast set up now next to my piano in the studio. So at some point, we may get a soundtrack for the interviews. Who knows? Stay tuned. Bye.